first framework for distributive justice that we're going to look at is utilitarianism. So why don't we hop into it? In actual fact, it's fairly simple given the work that we've already done in the course today. So the approach we take is the same as what we discussed in week 2 when we were looking at individual decisions. We need to identify happiness or pleasure as the greatest good. So that's our aim. Our aim is to maximize happiness or pleasure. And the moral act is that which generates the greatest good. So the utilitarian approach to justice just involves identifying the system or the rules and rights that generate the greatest happiness. Again, it's that maximizing happiness in the system. Just as the approach is very similar to that we discussed in week 2, the criticisms are similar as well. It's quite difficult to quantify happiness. It's difficult to predict the consequences of rules and rights. So we can plan something very logically, but it's amazing how people vary in their responses to rules and rights and how they try and get around them. It's also unclear which version of happiness we should maximize. Should it be pleasure or hedonism is the word we've been using in the course. Should it be well-being? Should it be about the preferences, like what we prefer? How are we actually going to, what kind of happiness should we be aiming to maximize? And we also can see distributions that appear unfair. So for instance, what would happen if it maximized happiness, say to give to people who avoid work? Okay, so not saying people who can't get work or whatever, but people who avoid work. So there's some sense that they really don't deserve it. But if that maximized happiness, that's what we'd have to do. So if we follow this approach, we can get unfair distributions or distributions that appear unfair under some definitions of what fairness is. In terms of it being a systemic approach, any utilitarian system is going to rely heavily on the analysis involved, and that involves a whole lot of social, economic, and political consequences and assumptions in any modelling that we do. That might just be about the simplest vodcast that we actually have. Of course, it relies very heavily on the work that we've already done in a utilitarian approach at the individual decision level, but it's essentially applying the same logic to the systemic level. What system maximizes happiness? That's the one we should go for. Okay, now let's move on to something a little bit different. And in the next vodcast, we're going to look at Nozick's approach, which is a libertarian or entitlement or rights-based approach to the distribution of benefits and burdens across society.